The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our webinar today. My name is John Coetzee. This webinar is TLDR on GDPR, what you need to know. And TLDR for our European participants is short for too long didn't read. That's kind of a big clue. This is not going to be your typical webinar. We're trying not to have long droning speeches for the answers. We're going to go fast. We're going to go live. We're going to try and have some fun. But on the way, we're going to generate and share some absolutely crucial insights that marketers need to thrive and perhaps even survive in some cases in what will potentially be a new data poor world, or not. Quick but important note, I know this will be shocking to everybody. We're not giving legal advice on this call for specific situations and specific people or companies. If you do have those specific legal questions, we really recommend that you talk to a qualified professional. Second note, before we get started, TUNE does an awesome conference every year in Seattle. This year it's in July 1920. And by attending this webinar, guess what? You didn't even know it. You've just qualified for a $200 discount. You can use code GPDR200 at postback.tune.com. Full details are coming in your email. You'll see it on screen in a while also, and you'll get all the information you need. Cool, let's get started. As you know, we're in some extremely pivotal times for marketers and advertisers. A lot of large tech companies have acquired an avalanche of customer and prospect data. On the one side, sometimes we're not really sure how to use it all or even how valuable it is. On another, we see that consumer data has sometimes been weaponized to uncertain levels of impact in divisive culture wars and sometimes political campaigns. So we're seeing some consumer backlash against data collection and use, sometimes misinformed, but building in anger. And all this is adding to an environment where GDPR and legislation like it, Europe is not alone here. Other states are following GDPR and putting things in place or thinking about laws like it. And all of this is going to fundamentally change what we do and how we do it. So GDPR is a landslide, but it's not the earthquake that caused the landslide. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for a new deal between publishers, consumers, and brands, and maybe governments. So we're going to talk about that. I want to introduce our panelists for you for a moment. You see them on screen right now. Super happy to have them, super thankful that they are spending an hour of their precious time here with us, giving us some insight. So Lika den Uden is Strategic Project Manager at AppLift. Her main focus right now is preparing AppLift for GDPR with, of course, a challenging deadline of 21st of May. And Lika's chief everyday activity is coordinating a team of law consultants and internal stakeholders to achieve this goal. She studied finance and investment, previously worked as a consultant, and now really wishes she had a law degree to help her through the day. We also have Meredith Halama, who's a privacy and security partner at Perkins Coie. Meredith's practice focuses on privacy with a particular focus on online advertising, which is perfect, of course, for this webinar. Before her current role, she served as Deputy General Counsel and Director of Compliance at the Network Advertising Initiative. She's living and breathing GDPR and e-privacy. And Ben Golden, our last panelist, is General Counsel at TUNE. He's formerly an attorney at Perkins Coie. It's funny, we just heard that name, Ben. Served on the University of Washington's Board of Regents, managed a state legislative campaign, researched in Ghana to launch a social enterprise, which is really, really cool, and split an apple strudel with Kofi Annan. I think I recognize that name, while working at a think tank in Salzburg. And he also lectured on Pink Floyd lyrics as an English teacher in Taiwan. Very, very interesting. I'm John Coetzee. I'm TUNE's mobile economist. I also write for Forbes and Inc. and a couple other places, and I've built a research organization in the past for VentureBeat, and I will be your moderator today. Excellent. So we're going to jump right in and try and have some fun here. Thanks again for joining us, and we're going to go right into it. First question, and I'm going to aim this at Lika and Meredith. 30 seconds or less. What is GDPR? Lika, why don't you start?
So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and it's a law designed by the European Union to hand back control to data subject when it comes to their data. This sounds very fancy, but if I rephrase it, it means that it's a law that puts customers back in control of their own data. It applies to any business, regardless of the location that they are situated, when they undergo data operations. then they are subject to it.
Wonderful, wonderful. I knew that we were not going to hit the 30 seconds there, but you came really, really close. Meredith,
I tried.
You did. Meredith, anything to add to that?
That was a great summary. I guess the only thing I would add is that unbeknownst to a lot of people, actually about 80% of the GDPR is very substantively in line with current law, but it's getting a lot of attention because there are some key differences. The biggest being the enforcement that's available, the penalties that are available, and for this audience in particular, the definition of personal data is broadened to include device identifiers, IP addresses, and cookie IDs.
Meredith, that is a great answer, and those dangers actually feed right into, segue very nicely into our next question, which is, we've seen some companies maybe really get very concerned about this, and I want to ask about GDPR and kind of a disaster. Will we see some companies crash and burn over GDPR, and do we have some examples? So I'm going to ask Ben first, are there some business models that are just going to die here or exit Europe?
I view this as business models taking a hit, but then adapting, evolving, and ultimately surviving at the end of the day. Evolution means change, not necessarily extinction. I think publishers that rely on getting a lot of data, they may worry about folks withholding consent, so their ad targeting may be a little bit less effective in the short run, or platforms that really provide customized services to customers. The bigger thing, though, is folks worrying about all of these changes. It's a big investment of time and money to get there. So the big players are going to be just fine, but for some folks, it's not going to pencil out at the end of the day. I'm aware of 2 companies that are winding down European operations, not global operations, because of GDPR. Cross-device target or drawbridge and location data firm Verve. And they won't be the last companies on this list, but I really don't believe GDPR is the end of digital advertising in the EU by any means. They're going to be the exception. And even then, shutting down operations in the EU, it's not going to escape GDPR. The other panelists talked about, this is becoming the new global standard.
Good. Interesting. So, will we see some companies fined? I mean, the fines are pretty significant. Like, when do you think we might see some fines, and do you think that's coming pretty quickly?
I don't know when we'll see them, because setting up all the things in place to prepare for GDPR takes a lot of time. I'm also pretty sure that an audit will also take a lot of time. But what I find very interesting to see as well is that besides the fine, there's also the Data Protection Authority also has the authority to include a temporary or a definite ban on processing data of a company. And if that happens, then yes, I think it has a lot of effect on the company, and especially if it's the key of your business model.
Wow, yes, that would be pretty challenging for an ad tech business or even a MarTech business. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to direct a question towards Meredith and Ben on GDPR and kind of well-intentioned brands. Because I've seen a lot of articles online that say things like brands that are already respectful of consumer data don't really need to be worried about GDPR. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's hand it to Meredith first.
I think I would say I sort of agree. I absolutely agree that those brands that have been mindful of privacy and thinking about data thoughtfully for a long time are at an advantage and have a great head start. But I would say it's necessary but not sufficient, which is not necessarily to say you should be worried about the GDPR, but still that there's a lot to do. There's a lot in the GDPR about process. So even, for example, if you're already doing all the right things, the GDPR says you need to write that down. You need to have policies, procedures. You may need to do data privacy impact assessments. You may need to appoint a DPO. So still a lot to do, but you're in really good shape if you've been thoughtful about these things for a long time.
Great answer. Ben, anything to add there?
Yeah, it's a great start, but you're not excused from doing the hard work at the end of the day. Respectful is wonderful, but you can still drop the ball. You've got to build really flexible and nimble back-end systems. And in addition to all that documentation Meredith talked about, which is endless, you got to build a really flexible back-end technological stack, and that can require some time and money to get there.
Yeah, I can see that. So let's talk about good intentions, that we just mentioned. We have this concept called legitimate interest in GDPR. Meredith, can you help us understand, what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So legitimate interest is one of 6 available legal bases for processing. And under the GDPR, you need to meet one of those 6. It doesn't matter what kind of notice or choice or anything else that you're doing if you can't meet one of those 6. So the 2 that are relevant to marketing are legitimate interest and consent. And essentially what legitimate interest is a balancing test where you put your interest in doing whatever it is that you want to do, what kind of data you're going to use and the like on one side of the scale, and you put the data subject's interest in not and avoiding that kind of processing on the other. And if your interests win out, you can move forward and you can engage in that. In the marketing context, and direct marketing is actually called out in the GDPR as constituting a legitimate interest. We don't know exactly what the bounds of direct marketing is, but there's some nod at least to marketing. In that marketing context, once that data subject objects and says, I don't want you to do this anymore, at that point you need to stop. In other words, that balance shifts back to the data subject once they object to the marketing.
Wow, wow, great answer. And it still leaves me wondering exactly what legitimate interest is. And I'm guessing that's going to be a challenge going forward. Lika, I'd like to address the next question to you, and it's about GDPR and legacy data. You know, you've got data already, right, that you've been acquiring for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, however long your company's been around. So go forward changes are always possible. But what about this legacy data? Will brands need to reacquire or just even acquire, maybe they didn't have it in the first place, consumer consent for everything they've done in the past and all the data they've collected in the past?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what needs to happen. From what we heard and read, it's not safe to rely on any leniency here when it comes to past legislation, and you should not expect any grace period. So everything is fully applicable in end of May. This means that companies should find a pragmatic approach to get reconsent or to renew permission if needed. And there are also other solutions such as anonymization or deletion of data. But you have to have a very good argument or business requirements why to use the personal data afterwards. If I look at how we are dealing with it, I think from the 25th onwards, all our data needs to be GDPR compliant, and not only the data that we generated from the 25th onwards.
Interesting. Good answer. And I don't know about the rest of us who are on this call, but I've had a recent flood of updated terms of service and conditions emails from many of the companies that I have accounts with, like Instagram, Facebook. I've seen a few others that came out as well, and I'm sure others are seeing that. Sticking with you, Lika, for just a minute here. We've talked about some of the risk factors, and we're going to talk more about those. And we talked about compliance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And most of the conversations around GDPR are on these topics. But is this also a business opportunity? And I don't mean for lawyers with more lawsuits and stuff. Is this also a business opportunity in GDPR?
Well, I think despite the challenges and the uncertainties and definitely the financial investments, I think it can ultimately be a good thing for the industry. I think professional and ethical companies, they will stand out and at some point in time recoup their investments. And also less serious actors will fall away. Looking at that, I think that it will strengthen EdTech and also increase advertiser trust. So yes, I think there is also like a positive part of it. I fully understand that currently everybody is focusing on its risk and the uncertainty, but I do feel that in the long run, yes, there will be opportunities, definitely.
Very cool. Let's talk a little bit about business processes, Ben, GDPR and business processes. So what's the best option here? If you're not a European company, you know you have some European customers, or you know that is a potential. Should you separate your business process rules into different streams, one for European customers and one for American customers, or any other country that you might happen to be in? Or should you try and build one stream for that fits everything?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to give you the answer everyone hates when you ask a lawyer. It depends. We've seen it from, even within multiple business lines at TUNE, and we've seen it at other companies. The answer is not always the same thing. It ultimately depends on a balancing act. You look at the consumer's preferences and their potential experience with the platform or advertisement. You have to balance it with the business impact of each of those options. Think about the operational burden of creating multiple rules by jurisdiction. It's often easier to just pick one thing and stick to it. Really what you're trying to do is respect the end user intent. But let's be clear about something else. GDPR only applies in the EU, but the zeitgeist is pretty clear that elevated data protection standards are here to stay, and a lot of other folks are going to follow the EU's lead. And so unless you want to keep paying a lawyer over and over again to parse rules by jurisdiction as they evolve, I think for a lot of companies, especially on the smaller side, it's just going to be easier in the long run to treat all customers the same.
Interesting. Good, good, good. I don't know if we have any Tolkien fans out there, but in The Lord of the Rings, one statement by, I believe, Gandalf is, go not to the elves for advice, for they will say both yea and nay. So you're now an honorary elf, Ben, and thank you for that answer. GDPR, GDPR and data partners. Let's chat about that. And I'm going to give the first question here to Meredith. You know, we're working with a lot of data partners right now. You might have third-party data. You might have first-party data that you're sharing, or second-party data. Is that less likely now? Is that harder to do? I kind of think so. But Meredith, if you're going to start that kind of partnership, a data partnership now, what are some of the first questions to ask?
Yeah, I agree that it's harder, and I agree with other comments that have been made that I think we'll see a transition period where there will be less data sharing as people sort of adjust, and we might see some players fall out of the ecosystem. But the questions I would ask if you're receiving data is, where did you get it? What was your legal basis for acquiring it? Do you have consent? If so, can I see that consent? If you're sharing data with others, I want to know, what are you going to do with it? Are you just using it for me? Are you going to combine it with other data? Are you going to allow others to benefit from it? I want to know if that party considers themselves to be a data controller or processor, because we are seeing very similarly situated companies reach different conclusions on that point, and it can really make a difference. And if I'm nervous about any of those answers to any of those questions, I want to know if I can lop off EU data, at least for now, while this settles out a little bit.
Meredith, great, great answers. And I just want to compliment all the members of our panel just here for a moment. You guys have been pros and stellar at not just giving answers, but doing them concisely. Very impressive. Ben, I'm going to direct the next one to you. You have a disaster. It's the nightmare scenario that you've been dreaming about, or sorry, having nightmares about. and you have a third-party data partner, and something goes wrong, and they lied, or they screwed up, or whatever. Can you get indemnified for bad or lazy or incompetent partners?
You know, it's 7 a.m. here in Seattle, and you're talking about nightmares, and we're just rolling out of bed here, so thanks for that, John. And for the clients and partners on the line, you know, TUNE sent updated terms last week, and so we have been seeing, you know, our agreements usually include some basic indemnity, and we're getting a lot more attention to those data protections and reps and warranties and liability and indemnity conversations, and that's great. But GDPR creates a shared responsibility between everybody in the chain, data controllers and processors. Everybody is part of the data flow. So one well-crafted legalese provision that, you know, includes a lopsided indemnity, it doesn't alleviate risk quite the same way it once did. And so no, I will not go to bed peacefully just because we have a good contract if we're working with a bad, lazy partner. You know, working with those folks, they're going to show in your service at the end of the day. And the reputational damage, forget just the partner-to-partner, business-to-business interaction. That's something to avoid in the first place. And so you talked about, Meredith discussed some of the diligence you need to do with your partners up front. That's the most important thing here. The best thing companies can do is collaborate with their business partners, have real conversations. There is a lot of opportunities Lika talked about to, you know, get to know your partners, understand that data flow better, and start to distinguish yourself. And so in addition to a lot of risk and compliance, like you said, GDPR is really prompting these conversations about responsibilities, about roles, and we're ending up with a healthier ecosystem so that this nightmare scenario is not a reality quite as often.
Ben, I'm going to stick with you for just a moment if we can, because that's a super interesting comment you just made. I mean, in the past, in sort of a data marketplace or data partnerships, you set it and forget it, right? I mean, we have this relationship, we put a contract in place, we might do some due diligence, and the data comes and you use the data and you just continue until there's a problem. But you're talking about a relationship, an ongoing relationship. So you might actually be thinking you kind of need to check in with partners on a monthly basis or something like that, maybe quarterly, and just ensure that all the protections that you thought were in place are still.
Yeah, well, I would say monthly, there's not enough time to do that, but absolutely some regular cadence. You know, we're seeing most often contractual commitments to do annual audits or to kind of show your cards of your every 6-month security penetration testing. And so what's happening is folks like me, for better or worse, are talking to our peers a lot more often. And I think in the long run, that's healthy. You don't want to bring in your lawyer when things get terrible. You want to bring in the compliance folks up front and make it preventative rather than fixing issues.
Super interesting, and that actually speaks to Lika's earlier point as well about the bad actors or the not so good actors in ad tech or martech might start dropping off because they can't continue to compete with the new requirements. Lika, we're going to stick with you for sort of the third part of this GDPR and data partners question. You know, we have third-party data vendors. How do they survive in this new reality?
Well, I think that they have to relook at how they are obtaining and managing their data and how they share it, which again will, from my expectations, lead to a shift in the market because some of the lower level players could be taken out. I think overall there will be less data and it might be more expensive because it's harder to get. But I do think that the quality might go up because the data that is to be shared is also shared with consent. So that should work and improve. And I think for companies working with third-party data and the vendors, you should really take into account how trustworthy is the vendor and can they provide you with enough evidence to show that they meet the GDPR standards. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge.
Interesting. Good. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to address the next question to Meredith, and we're going to talk about GDPR certification. So you're putting on all this energy to get certain to be ready for GDPR, and we've already had a couple questions where it's a it depends question, or it's kind of a well, what is legitimate interest? It kind of it's a balancing scale. It seems challenging. I'm wondering if you can get certified GDPR compliant. Is that even possible? And would that be worthwhile, Meredith?
No, unfortunately, and there's a lot of confusion. I hear a lot of questions about, well, we want to get certified. And I think it goes to some fundamental confusion with that, and that what was the safe harbor, now the privacy shield, which it does operate as a certification program where you take certain steps and you check the boxes and then you are certified. And there are some private entities that will oversee that certification for you. There's a lot in the GDPR about codes of conduct and certifications and the like. And so we may see some of these programs emerge where taking certain steps sort of gives you a stamp of approval. But right now, there's really nothing like that. There certainly are some companies that will help you to become GDPR compliant and help you to market yourself as GDPR compliant, but nothing that is blessed as kind of like a safe harbor program similar to like what we have with COPPA here in the US.
Right. You can't get the sticker to put on your website, GDPR compliant, and certified by some lawyer or foundation or something like that. Too bad. Let's talk about situations that could happen here, Lika, about proving compliance. So here's a scenario. You implement GDPR, as everybody is right now. The EU comes calling, and they think maybe they got a customer complaint, maybe they just saw something, maybe who knows what happened. They think somehow you've done it wrong. How do you prove the compliance?
Well, I think the first thing that we would do is call our data protection officer so he can help us out. But I would give the authority access to our data protection management system, which is a framework that includes all the information and policies that we've put in place and how we can show that how we enhance privacy. It contains, amongst others, records of processing activities, which are personal data flow mappings, where you can see what kind of data we store, how we store it, what we do with it, how long we keep it, who has access to it, and why we need it. But also all the contracts in our contractual framework, which includes contracts with vendors, but also additional data protection agreements with clients. It has a lot of other information, such as our deletion and retention period, and all our technical and organizational matters. So I think with that, that's the first thing that we would share, and then afterwards we would help out and give all the information that is necessary to prove our compliance.
Right, right. Great answer, Lika. And I'm just going to stick with you for half a second, if I could. And so let's say you share that data, you share your standards and everything like that. Is there a point at which that you would want to do maybe a code level review, or want to have access to your database to prove what's in there? Is that a possibility?
Yes, that is also a possibility. If it's necessary, we can show that. I think like the first step is to show what measures we've been taken, and also what and how we protect our data. But yes, if it's necessary, definitely.
Interesting, interesting. Very, very good. Okay, so we've been talking about Europe so far, and how the new rules there impact Europe, obviously, but around the world as well. So Europe is doing GDPR, but we've seen some things in other places. California has a potential ballot initiative to enact some very GDPR-like privacy rules, and other states and countries may well follow. I want to direct this to Ben first. What are the odds that we're going to see GDPR-like legislation in the US and or in the rest of the world?
I think very good. I think the writing on the wall is clear. We're going to see more data protection legislation all around the world. I don't think it's going to be copy and paste GDPR. I think a lot of the how they solve things, and they've got all these working groups trying to parse everything. That's a very EU-centric approach to some of the things, but do expect high-level principles that are embedded in GDPR to spread. But in the meantime, the EU is going to be enforcing its own law. They're going to be doing interpretations of these nuanced edge cases. We talked about how do you show compliance and certification. It's not very clear on some of these issues. It's not necessarily binary. If you do this, you're good. If you don't, you're out. And so as the GDPR may be tweaked over time, I think the attention's still going to remain on how is the EU taking the lead on this, and other folks will follow. For now, I don't see a lot of countries or states going beyond the level set in the EU.
Good, good, good. Meredith, any other thoughts on that?
No, I agree with everything Ben said. I guess I'd offer the DC perspective, which is that what gets attention is really driven by headlines, and headlines today, sort of outside of the GDPR, have really been focused on privacy and real impacts it has on people. And so it used to be my job to go to the Hill and follow, bills, and for quite a while, I would say 5, 6, 8 years, none of those bills have had a serious chance of passing. And I think that is the percent chance of that happening is increasing now with all the attention. I think we'll also see companies less will to fight against any proposed laws now, because to Ben's earlier point, they're building to the GDPR anyway. And so when a law is proposed in the US that imposes substantially similar requirements, there might be less resistance to that law.
Excellent, excellent. And for our international audience, Meredith, what hill were you going to?
That would be Capitol Hill. Thank you.
Excellent. No worries. Yeah, not just any hill, it's the hill. Very good. Lika, we're going to go to you for the next question, and it's one more of these nightmare scenarios that's keeping Ben up at night. Probably you also, and maybe Meredith as well. And I want to talk about GDPR and hacking. It happens all the time. We see it. In fact, there was a casino. The news came out a couple weeks ago or last week. A casino that got hacked, and the attack vector was a smart thermometer in a fish tank in the casino head office. Believe it or not, actually happened. So you get hacked, and customer data is out in the wild. Under GDPR, what do you have to do, and when?
So when this happens, we should always report it immediately to the right parties, and I would always also contact our data protection officer to help us out. It depends on the role we have. So if we are a controller of the data, one of the first actions we need to take is notify the data protection authorities, and this needs to be done within 72 hours after we became aware of the breach. And obviously, also apart from that, we have to take the appropriate measures to limit any consequences for data subjects and take additional security matters. If we are working as a processor of the data, we must notify the controller in this regard. and we have to inform them immediately so that they can take the necessary actions. And then again, we have to know to take all the appropriate measures. But yeah, there's a distinction there.
Good, Lika. I'm going to stick with you again and just say no if you're not comfortable answering this one. But let's assume that somebody's going to get hacked because it's going to happen, and some data is going to be out there. What can you do before that happens, such that personal or identifiable information isn't leaked? Are there some things you can do with how you store that data, what format it's in, or how you store personally identifiable things that make it hard for attackers who gain access to your data to actually sort of reconstitute it in personally identifiable ways?
So yeah, what we are looking into is to anonymize it. This is going to be very technical, and I'm pretty sure that my tech team can explain it much better than I can do.
Yes.
But there are many ways to anonymize it in a way, and you have to really take into account how far personal identifiable information reaches. So you also have to anonymize the right parts of it, and you have to have the right protection measures there. I don't know. Yeah, I do know the names. I'm not 100% sure. Our tech team knows it, but yeah, it's a lot of technical measures.
Yes. So involve your technical people and make sure that you minimize the consequences before an attack happens. Absolutely. Ben, I'm going to turn to you for the next one here, and I want to talk about GDPR and verification. So under GDPR, someone can ask you to delete all the data you have about them from your database. Can you talk about that a little bit, and then also talk about, how can you possibly verify that that's happened?
Yeah, briefly on the last one, because we're having, of course, the same challenges. We're a data processor here at TUNE. And so how do we at least minimize the potential impact if one of those awful scenarios occurs? And so we have implemented log level rolling retention windows of a maximum of 25 months, and then we let the data controllers, our clients, tighten that. On the HasOffers side, we now have obfuscation of IP addresses originating in the EU and blanking of device IDs. And so there are steps you take, but it is a balancing act. You look at what is the purpose of why is somebody paying us to help them out? Can we still do that? And then do everything else you can to minimize the risk and reduce the personal data that may flow through your system. So it's a challenge that every company is going through, and the technical folks are getting to learn the law.
Yes.
To actually answer your question, John, you're asking how do you prove a negative in a lot of ways.
Yes.
It's been a really tricky one, a chicken and egg scenario. So taking a step back, yeah, if an individual or company controls the data, or an end user, is their data, they're going to communicate that down the chain. It may get to the data controller or the processor, and those folks are going to be obligated to delete the data. That's the new normal, and that's fine. That's good policy. Individuals are going to need to make the request with the company that they have that direct relationship with. And verification is going to be real tough. I think we haven't seen an industry best practice emerge and everyone rally behind. It's going to be a mix of audits when appropriate, but those can be really timely and costly and distracting. More likely, you're going to see a lot of, hey, I asked you to delete my data. Can you send me a written certification promising you did that? And that's fine. It is what Cambridge Analytica did for Facebook, and that didn't work out so hot.
Yes.
My money is going to be on the IAB's new consent mechanism, but even company to company, we're seeing a wide range of different workflows. And one challenge I just want to bring up, because I haven't seen a lot of press around this, but a challenge that we're worried about is making sure when someone asks you, hey, delete this data set, you got to authenticate that it's the right thing. You could imagine Lyft coming in. I'm sorry, I'm going to use a couple of real company names, and they're totally hypothetical. Let's say Lyft comes in and says, hey, we should delete our data. Oh, by the way, we're Uber. Go ahead and delete their data. You can get some bad actors out there to make a request that they don't have the responsibility or right to delete. And so we are engaging our principal security engineer to work through these communication flows. The lessons we've learned about phishing efforts in the past and other cybersecurity threats, make sure that we've approached that before we commit to one thing, and before you press that delete button, make sure you know what you're doing, because that's hard to walk back. because you can't. So
that is a scenario I had not even imagined happening. A competitor of some company saying, "Hey, I'm one of the customers of another company, and requesting data be deleted." That could be very devastating. Interesting, and I suspect it may happen. One of the interesting things about this particular question about deleting your data just became really obvious why that's an issue this past week, because Match.com actually had some customer profiles that were supposed to be deleted like a decade ago suddenly revive. I don't know if everybody saw the news on that, but there's some happily married people whose Match.com profiles were suddenly reactivated, and they had 10 or 20 requests for, hey, let's get together or something like that. So there are some challenges existing in the industry around that. Good. Moving along to GDPR myths with Meredith. There's a lot of myths surrounding GDPR as well. What are some of the most ridiculous?
Well, I want to caveat by saying I don't even know if I would call any of them ridiculous, because this is a confusing law, and so
right.
It's understandable the confusion that's out there. But I will say a few things that are literally not true, but are sort of stated often as true. Is one, that it governs everyone and everything in the whole wide world. It's absolutely true that it has an increased territorial scope, but to Ben's point earlier, some companies are pulling out of the EU in order to avoid the application of the GDPR, and so that is an option. Another one is that you need consent for absolutely everything you do. Like I mentioned earlier, there are 6 legal bases for processing. You may be able to use legitimate interests for some things. Another thing I touched on before is that it's all new. It's not. A lot of the fundamentals of the bones of this law are actually identical to current data protection law in Europe. And another thing I touched on earlier is that the GDPR is a replacement of the Privacy Shield. Right? I've heard this a lot. It's Safe Harbor, and then it was Privacy Shield, and now it's GDPR. Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield are just mechanisms for transferring data to the US. That's all they are. The GDPR is much more expansive. It covers all data you're processing from individuals in the EU, essentially.
Very, very good. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Alika for the next one, and it's about GDPR and artificial intelligence and targeting. And we are using AI much more now in ad tech and martech, and often to target an ad to a particular individual. So here's the question. Under GDPR, don't you have to be able to explain to a user why they're getting a certain ad or offer? And if that offer is a result of a sort of a machine learning based targeting, maybe you don't even know it's a black box and it just came out with that particular targeting. How do you enable that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting challenge. It's true, under the GDPR, those who are targeted, let's say with machine learning models, have the right for explanation on how the model made this decision, and also get enough understanding on the significance of the consequences. This is mainly to give them enough information to make informed decisions, such as, for instance, opt out. But unfortunately, machine learning is very difficult to explain. I think it's maybe even more difficult than setting it up and training it. So yeah, I think in order to be able to do so, in the end, machine learning needs to become more transparent, but we are not there yet. I think that will take years. I think how we would tackle it now would be to have a very clear technical description on how the model works and make it understandable for data subjects, and also to explain how we use it in practice, so how it works, to try to educate the data subject as much as possible. But I do think that in order to really enable this, we need much more information about machine learning. So I think time will tell.
I think that's a great answer, because it's really challenging, because I mean, the point of putting a machine learning solution in place is that the machine learns things that you don't know. And it learns that there's a process of seeing data that you haven't yet seen. And so it's not clear, when you're setting that model up, what actually is going to happen with that. It's got a life of its own in some way, shape, or form. And so I think you're right. We're some years away from that. I'm going to stick with you, Lika, for a secondary question, which is a little bit related. And we're going to talk about GDPR and programmatic advertising. And so some companies, including PageFair, says that GDPR and programmatic advertising are fundamentally incompatible. For example, you need consent for showing relevant ads, for creating a profile based on browsing habits, for seeing if someone interacted with an ad, and so on. Do you agree with that?
I don't think it's that black and white. It's definitely a challenge, but you also see initiatives in the market to find a way to make it work. One of those initiatives is, for instance, the IAB Tech Lab that is looking into the problem and set up a technical working group to come up with a solution. And what they came up with now is an open RTB function, which enables you to push the consent of a user, of a data subject, through the supply chain, the digital supply chain. And it enables you to share the data field that indicates if you are an EU data subject, and also if you consented to see targeted ads. So if you did, then we are able to see that information and still target you. Currently, this is only going one way, so it's going from the publisher to the advertiser, and we need to have it the other way around as well. But I do think that it's really nice that you see players from different positions in the market join forces to make it work. So yes, it's a challenge, but I don't think it's fundamentally incompatible.
Great answer. Thank you so much for teasing out those details. Meredith, I'm going to move to you, and I'm going to talk about GDPR and European websites, website visitors or app users for companies that are outside of the EU. So if Europeans happen to use your website or app, and guess what? You know, most websites can be accessed from just about anywhere in the world, not except Russia. I'm in Russia right now, and there's a lot that isn't accessible. But if Europeans happen to use your website or app, and you don't intentionally target or monetize them, do you still have to worry about GDPR?
Yeah, I guess consistent with the theme of today's conversation, there's not entirely clear answers here, but what is clear is that the GDPR does have a territorial scope. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but in Article 3, and it essentially boils down to this. There are 3 ways that you can come into scope. One is if you have an establishment in the EU. So if you have an office there, you're likely in scope. And then the other is if you don't have an establishment, but you're offering goods and services to data subjects in the EU. So if you're a brand or retailer and you're shipping in or selling your goods in the EU, you're going to be in scope. And the final way is, if you don't have an establishment in the EU, but you are monitoring the behavior of data subjects in the EU. So, you know, if you're an ad network, probably just one passive collection of information about someone who happens to be in the EU won't be sufficient, but you don't necessarily need to be intentionally trying to monitor behavior. Probably anything more than just incidental every once in a while catching someone in the EU is going to be sufficient.
Okay, interesting. Good. Let's go back to Ben for the next one, and I want to talk about GDPR and blockchain. So Ben, as we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt from blockchain experts that we see everywhere these days, blockchain is going to save us from hunger, cancer, war, stub toes, you name it. Can it fix ad tech and martech for GDPR as well?
Love it. You know, John, you see me on the cryptocurrency Slack channel, internal Slack channel at TUNE, and I'm not a Kool-Aid drinker for blockchain. But that said, I do think they can get along really well, and I think that actually it's going to be a net positive at the end of the day. You know, both the blockchain technology and what GDPR is trying to do are promote transparency and ability to verify that you're doing the right thing, and making sure that data ownership is in the hands of the individual. And so, you know, blockchain does this. It creates that decentralized public ledger of every change, especially on content. You can track a story, track an individual's interaction with a marketing campaign, who accessed it. That can be really interesting and be a big boon for digital advertising. But I don't think we're there yet. In the short term, it's actually going to be a complication, I believe. You know, GDPR assumes personal data, you know, it's stored with centralized parties. And so when blockchain talks about decentralizing everything, that's going to make it a little bit trickier to implement GDPR standards, where you need to lock down every step of the data flow. Blockchain is supposed to create this immutable ledger that cannot be deleted okay, well, GDPR has these very important data minimizations and access and rectification principles. So those conflict. GDPR tries to tame, we always joke about how digital advertising has been the Wild West, and this is starting to bring some regulation into this universe, and sophisticated commercial actors are stepping in and cooperating with regulators who actually have enforcement powers. Well, blockchain is its own thing and growing organically, and we don't really know. So we got to see who the grown-ups are going to be in blockchain and how those two can get along. But because they have the same intent, I think that the story is just beginning.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Very cool. Let's turn back to Lika for a second here and talk about GDPR and non-personalized ads. So we've talked about some challenges with personalizing advertising and with targeting advertising. It's not insurmountable, as we've talked about, but it does make it more challenging. So the question is, if GDPR kills or wounds personalized advertising, or a fraction of it, then we're back to contextual advertising, I guess. How much worse or better is that?
I think it's a useful option for any business that's looking for a risk-free or less risky option under GDPR. It will minimize advertisers' risk, and ads will not be targeted using any personal data. So you can also still reach out to the opted-out data users. But I think in terms of effectiveness, I still believe that personalized advertisement works better. You see that Google is working on a non-personalized ad option right now in order to help publishers comply with GDPR. So yeah, I think it could be a nice option.
Good, good, thank you. Ben, coming back to you on portability, GDPR and portability. So according to GDPR, people own their own data and it should be portable. Can you talk about what does that mean? And does it mean that CSV will rule ad tech?
Yeah, so portability, it's called out even in the regulation, and it's really just the right to transfer personal data from one organization that might hold it to another, or even all the way back to the data subject, the individual. And the intent is great. It's to hand control of personal data back to the individual. It's creating accountability for any organization that you have, whether you knew that or not in the past, holds your data. And so it's just the idea of, well, if it's yours and someone else has it, you should be able to move it. In practice, I use the phrase flexible for back-end systems. And of course, our technology team hates that when I use that with them. But that's really what we're trying to do here. You need to quickly identify a specific data point and then carry out the specific action. It might be erasure. I think we're going to see a lot more data deletion requests than portability requests. But hey, a client may say, we don't want to do business with you, we want to work with the competitor, move our data along. Or an individual says, I'm done with Instagram, but I'm really into Snapchat, I want my history of some sort passed along. I want them to advertise with really great custom advertisements. Help me move that data along. It's that high level concept. And yeah, we talked a lot about some of those authentication challenges. And I think for that reason, until some of those are figured out before we can know that when somebody's making an API call, the right person's doing it, and back on all of those nuances, I do think that we are going to see a lot of CSV files spread around the internet like weeds to deal with the portability request.
That is so interesting, and I don't know if we should stick with you, Ben, for just a moment there, but just imagine that scenario where somebody says to a social network, I want all my data from you, and I want to transfer it to another social network. It's almost unthinkable right now, but is that what the law is basically saying?
I think in principle, that's what they're trying to get at. You've been interacting, you've been sharing your personal data, you're exchanging it, you get some service in exchange for opening up and giving your privacy rights, but now you can take those back. And instead of taking them back and then recreating them with someone else, you can just skip that step and say, hey, company X, I need you to share that with company Y because I want to start working with them instead. I think we're going to see this more likely between an entire company, a data controller as a company, choose to work with a different vendor. But I do think my hypothetical would hold up. I don't know that anyone cares enough to pass their contextual advertising profile somewhere new, but in principle, I think that's the intent.
I'm going to guess that even if there aren't people that actually care about that, there are people that are going to try it just because it's available and they want to see what happens. There's enough people on the internet these days that just about anything will happen. Okay, I'm going to stick with you, Ben, here for a second. And but Meredith, Lika, feel free to chime in on this one. Here's the question. If there was one thing you had to focus on regarding GDPR compliance, what would it be?
Oh man, I've been talking a lot about the beauty of all of these dialogues and open communication and commercial partners working together. But if there's one thing, I think you got to look inward. There's so many things companies ought to be doing to gear up and prepare. And we talked about being respectful of end user rights and move in that right direction. But step one is understand your own systems. What personal data do you have? Where do you have it? Why do you have it? And then make a game plan around that. A lot of companies like TUNE, including, we've been gearing up since 2016, and the major strides forward really happened when we finally completed a comprehensive data map, understood what we were dealing with under the covers internally. And it's also a great way to get cross-functional teams thinking about this, learning about this, growing awareness. That's, you're actually helping with privacy by design and default when you're looking inward like this. And so number one is look in the mirror and really understand exactly what you are doing. Know your song well before you start singing and talking to your partners.
Wonderful. Lika, Meredith, you don't have to jump in here, but if you had one thing, what would it be?
I guess I would add to what Ben said. I totally agree with starting with knowing your data and what you're doing. I guess I would just say that when you're understanding your own data, to the extent you have other data controllers like ad networks or ad tech companies who are also collecting data directly from your site or your app, start talking to them, understand how they're going to get consent, whether you need to get consent for them. I'm seeing so many people in their own silos and so focused on what they're doing, and it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that you might be enabling other people to collect data, and you're ultimately going to be responsible for what they do.
Cool, cool. Lika, anything here, or should we go to the next one?
No, I think I agree with it. I think it's also GDPR has been a good opportunity to look into what is happening internally, because you see a company moving forward, and you never have that moment of reflection where you look into, like, what are we actually doing with the data, and what do we need and what don't we need. And this is the right time, and it's really valuable also.
Good. Okay, so let's peer into our crystal balls here. And I'm going to ask this question for each person, starting with Meredith. When are we going to see the first penalties under GDPR? Do you think it's going to be this year, 2018? Do you think it's going to be 2019? Do you think it's going to be next month? What do you think it's going to be? Meredith first.
Okay, so disclaimer, I think I have a terrible crystal ball. And there are probably people who are much closer to all of this in the EU who are much better predictors. But I will say what I would be thinking and doing if I were a regulator in the EU, and perhaps underfunded, as I think many of them are. I have brand new now data breach reporting obligations of people within my jurisdiction. I'm going to have companies coming to me and saying, we suffered a breach and this data went missing. I'm going to start there. I think those are easy targets where I now have, massive finding available to me, and I might be able to build up my resources that way. So if I were a regulator, I would be focusing on companies that come to me to report breaches and extracting fines from them.
So that probably means sometime in June, July, or August, because it's going to happen. Awesome. Lika, what are you saying?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I think it will take some time, especially if you look at the reach of data and how well you have to assess it. There are some rumors in Germany that the authorities are already mentioning that they will visit certain companies. But yeah, those are rumors. What I know is that all companies and all people that I talk to are working very hard on preparing for GDPR. But I think that 2019, or I hope 2019, it's going to be the year so that we have some time.
Yes, good, good, good. I noticed you very carefully did not provide any rumors or names with those rumors, but I totally understand why. That's all good. Ben, turning to you, when will we see the first penalties?
I don't think it's going to be May 26th. You know, I don't think GDPR is Y2K. This is the cliff. I do think we're going to see a lot of high-profile investigations kicked off pretty soon, though. But I think the goal is to work towards a better internet, not just punishment. And so the major dialogues and investigations are going to start real soon, but I don't think money is going to start to exchange hands until 2019.
Wow, excellent. Very good. Wonderful. So just sort of a note here to everybody who's listening. This has been amazing so far. We're not quite done yet. It's been incredible. Basically, 95% of the people who started on this call at the beginning are still here, which is unheard of for a webinar. Super happy about that. We know that many could not get on. We had a max audience attendee list here, and so this will be available for others to see later as well. But I wanted to offer the opportunity for closing statements from each participant, starting with Ben and then Lika and then Meredith.
Yeah, and thanks again, John, for pulling this together. A lot of fun to catch up with Lika and Meredith as well. GDPR is unprecedented in its impact and scope, and it's fun to see these elevated expectations for privacy and security for everyone. It's a new world. And yeah, we're 1 month away today. Everyone get excited. The 30-day countdown is on. But like I said before, May 25th is not going to be the end of the story. We're going to see case law out of EU courts, regulatory guidance, keeps coming out every day. It seems like these working parties are just very productive. We're going to see additional legislative changes. There's going to be clarifications. And then it's going to be up to industry and the commercial partners to evolve over these next few months, and I think it's going to be these next few years before the best practices are really illuminated, and we get past those murky, well, I'm doing it this way, is that good enough, ambiguities. And so maybe just on behalf of TUNE, since we pulled this one together, just a quick thank you to all those partners who've been reaching out, and we do look forward to working with everybody. We do want to build just this more secure, transparent, and privacy-centric advertising ecosystem, and so we're happy to have you guys as partners.
Wonderful. Lika?
Yeah, so what I say is that the GDPR keeps us very busy, and I don't think that anybody can fully assess the effect of it yet. Every answer to a question raises two new questions, and it goes on and on. But I do believe that in the end, it will raise our industry standards and also the way we conduct business. It will separate the serious players from the ones that aren't quite as committed. And I think we have to work together to make it work.
Wonderful. Meredith, you have the last word.
It's a lot of pressure, especially when Lika and Ben have spoken so eloquently. I agree with everything they've said. I think the only thing I would add is that I do think from May 25th for at least 6 months, probably a year, will be a period, especially in the ad tech ecosystem, of profound uncertainty. I think we're going to see agreements that don't make a whole lot of sense for what's actually going on. I think we're going to see similarly situated companies taking different positions. I think we'll see some traffic being cut off. But I agree with Lika and Ben that ultimately, after we get through that rather rough transition, it will be good for everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful. I want to thank each of you, Ben, Lika, Meredith. You guys have been amazing. You've dropped some incredible wisdom on all of us and some knowledge. You guys are sitting right on the front row of what's going on with GDPR and what people need to do about it. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. We really do appreciate it. For our listeners on the webinar today, we will put some answers on the blog, some of these things that we've been talking about on this webinar today, and we'll put that on the TUNE blog at tune.com/blog, so you'll be able to see it in written form as well. We did get some audience submitted questions, in fact, some really, really detailed and tough ones. We'll do our best to answer some of those as well. And as I noted right off the top, we do have our post-back conference every year. This time it's in July in Seattle, which is amazing and wonderful in July. And we're giving you $200 off with the code that's on your screen right now. And there's more details coming in the email to you. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Wish you the very best of success in everything that you're doing, especially GDPR related. And join us again on another TUNE webinar. Goodbye.